You can grow up in a good home and still be shaped in ways you don't recognize. Not because something terrible happened, but because certain patterns quietly became normal. And when you don't have a bad story to point to, those effects can be the hardest to see and the easiest to dismiss. Part 1. Why this feels so confusing. One of the most confusing emotional experiences in adulthood is sensing that something affected you while also feeling like you're not allowed to claim it. You watch psychology content. You hear people describe emotional patterns, self-silencing, overfunctioning, chronic restraint, and something in you recognizes it instantly. Not intellectually, viscerally. And then the second thought arrives. But my childhood was fine. I shouldn't relate to this. Other people had it way worse. So instead of getting curious, you invalidate your own reaction. This happens because many of us were taught, implicitly, that only extreme experiences matter. That unless something was clearly wrong, there's nothing to examine. So we compare. And comparison shuts the whole process down. But psychology doesn't operate on a suffering leaderboard. Your nervous system doesn't scan the world and say, well, others had it worse, so this doesn't count. It simply adapts to what it experiences consistently. Another reason this feels confusing is that people often confuse explanation with exaggeration. If you talk about impact, it sounds like you're claiming harm. If you explore influence, it sounds like you're accusing someone. So instead of exploring your inner patterns, you minimize them. And when experiences are minimized, they don't disappear. They just become harder to understand. Part 2. Shaped doesn't mean damaged. Here's the distinction that most conversations skip. Being shaped is not the same as being damaged. Every human being adapts to the emotional environment they grow up in. That's not dysfunction. That's development. Children aren't focused on authenticity or self-actualization. They're focused on connection. Long before they can put it into words, they're constantly learning things like, what version of me fits here? What responses are welcomed? What creates ease? What creates tension? And then they adjust. If calm was valued, they learned calm. If independence was admired, they learned self-sufficiency. If emotions were allowed but not deeply engaged with, they learned containment. No single event is required. No dramatic rupture. Just repetition. Often what gets learned isn't, this is unsafe, but these parts of me work better than others. That's not damage. That's adaptation. The issue isn't that these adaptations formed, it's that they often stay in place long after the environment that shaped them is gone. Part 3. Signs something shaped you. Not as a clear memory or a dramatic story, but as patterns in how you move through the world. Patterns that feel ordinary, automatic, like they're simply how you are. One place this often shows up is in how closely you monitor yourself. You may notice you're almost always tracking yourself, your tone, your timing, your emotional volume. You don't just speak, you notice yourself speaking. You register how it lands, and later you replay it in your head. Not because you're insecure, and not because you're doing something wrong, but because awareness became automatic early on. Another place this shows up is around expressing needs. There's often a quiet discomfort with expressing needs. Not dramatic, just heavy. You might struggle to name what you want until it becomes unavoidable. And even then, asking can feel like you're creating a problem simply by having preferences. So you default to, I'm fine. Even when you're unsure, even when you're tired, even when something doesn't sit quite right. And if you're noticing that some of this fits while other parts don't, that's okay. You don't have to recognize yourself in every example for this to be relevant. For some people, the pattern goes even deeper and shows up as responsibility for the emotional tone around them. You notice shifts immediately. A pause, a change in energy, a moment of tension. And before anyone says anything, you adjust yourself to smooth it over. Not because someone demanded this of you, but because harmony mattered. Over time, this often turns into an identity. Being easy, low maintenance, flexible, the one who doesn't need much. This trait is usually praised. It keeps things calm, it keeps things moving. But it can quietly disconnect you from your own internal signals. You become skilled at accommodating and less practiced at checking in with yourself. For others, the sign shows up as difficulty knowing what you actually want. Not indecision exactly, more like a blank space where desire should be. You know what's logical. You know what makes sense. You know what would look reasonable from the outside. But what feels genuinely right takes longer to surface. And sometimes, all of this adds up to being highly functional but emotionally muted. You show up, you handle things, you're capable and reliable. But something feels turned down. Not depressed, not empty, just contained. Like your emotional range learned to stay within certain limits. None of these means something went wrong. They're the kinds of things you learn without realizing you're learning them. Part 4. Why you don't remember anything wrong. Because what shaped you usually wasn't something that happened. It was something that was always there. It was the emotional background you grew up inside. The tone, the expectations, the unspoken rules. At this point, a lot of people wonder, if this really mattered, wouldn't I remember it? Not necessarily. Children don't evaluate the environments they grow up in. They don't analyze them. They adapt to them. What's familiar becomes normal. If emotional restraint was normal, it felt normal. If being self-sufficient was expected, it felt mature. If feelings were acknowledged but not explored, it felt sufficient. And because there was no sharp contrast, nothing stood out as wrong. Memory tends to preserve extremes, conflict, crisis, rupture. It's much less likely to record atmospheres, tones, expectations, unspoken rules. Another reason is that adaptation happens early, before conscious reflection. Long before you could think, this is what's expected of me, your system was already adjusting. So the absence of anger doesn't invalidate impact. You don't need resentment for something to have shaped you. Sometimes the most influential experiences were also the most ordinary. Part 5. This is not about blame. Because noticing how something shaped you doesn't mean someone did something wrong. This part matters. Most caregivers did the best they could with the tools they had. Many were loving, attentive, and well-intentioned, and still limited. Not because they failed, but because every system has edges. Families shape behavior. Cultures shape behavior. Emotional climates shape behavior, often unintentionally. This isn't about reframing your past as secretly harmful. It's about understanding how your present patterns were formed. You can acknowledge influence without turning it into accusation. You can recognize limits without erasing care. And you can explore impact without rewriting your history as a tragedy. Clarity is not an attack. It's orientation. If this way of explaining psychology resonates, without blame, without labels, without oversimplifying, like and subscribe. This channel focuses on finishing the thoughts most conversations leave incomplete, especially for people who feel shaped but don't fit obvious narratives. Part 6. What awareness actually gives you. So why does recognizing this matter? Because awareness gives you choice. When you see that certain behaviors were adaptive, you stop treating them as personal flaws. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what was this designed to do? Your restraint makes sense. Your caution makes sense. Your emotional efficiency makes sense. They weren't random. And once something is understood, it no longer runs entirely on autopilot. You don't need to reject who you were. You don't need to resent where you came from. You simply get to decide which adaptations still serve you and which ones you've outgrown. That's agency without bitterness, growth without erasure. And that's often the missing piece. You don't need a dramatic backstory for your inner world to deserve attention. You don't need a label for your experience to be real. And you don't need to accuse the past to understand the present. Sometimes the most meaningful shift is simply realizing this. Nothing bad had to happen for something important to have happened. And understanding that is often where real change quietly begins.